I'm a long-haul trucker. Lonely roads, endless nights, and the melodies of the highway have been my companions for years. The roar of the engine is a constant melody, and the asphalt beneath my wheels is the only thing keeping me moving. But lately, the exhaustion had been building up, and I longed for a break. Vacation. A sweet word that hadn't been part of my vocabulary for a long time. So, when my boss offered me one last delivery before a well-deserved rest, I didn't think twice. The route would be long, but the reward would be worth it. 2 weeks off to rest and, maybe, even see family. The task seemed simple: transport a load from a warehouse in the countryside to a remote location in the mountains. No questions, no unnecessary details. Just pick it up and deliver it. I had done it before, and monotony was part of the job. But this time, something was different. When I arrived at the warehouse to pick up the load, I felt a strange chill. It was a muggy night, and the air felt heavy, as if something invisible was watching me. The men loading the truck were oddly quiet, avoiding eye contact and murmuring among themselves. It wasn't unusual to see reserved people in places like that, but there was something about the way they acted that unsettled me. The cargo itself was a large container, sealed with heavy-duty locks. "What's inside?" I asked, trying to ease the tension with casual conversation. One of the men, without lifting his gaze, mumbled, "None of your business. Just your job." The curt reply took me by surprise. Normally, the loaders were more friendly, maybe even joking about the contents. But not this time. As I climbed into the truck cabin, I took one last look at the container, feeling a wave of unease. The road ahead promised to be long and lonely, and the idea of being alone with that mysterious cargo made me uncomfortable. However, the promise of vacation right after the delivery was enough to push my doubts aside. I took a deep breath and started the engine, leaving the warehouse and those silent figures behind. As I drove down the dark road, I couldn't help but wonder what exactly I was transporting. Something dangerous? Something valuable? The possibilities ran through my mind, but I knew that the less I knew, the better. So, I decided to focus on the road and what awaited me at the end of this journey: rest and peace. But deep down, an unsettling voice whispered that this trip might not be as simple as the others. Maybe, this time, the road held something more than just solitary landscapes and endless miles. But for now, I pushed those thoughts away and pressed on, with the moon as my only witness that night. The night was dark and silent, except for the constant hum of the engine and the sound of the truck's wheels rolling over the asphalt. During the early hours, everything seemed normal. But as the moon reached its highest point in the sky, things began to change. It was subtle at first, a strange vibration running through the container, emitting a deep and disturbing sound. I thought it was just the uneven terrain or maybe the truck itself, but the vibration was rhythmic, almost as if something inside was trying to get out. The unease I had felt at the warehouse returned full force, and a chill ran down my spine. I decided to stop at a rest area to get a coffee and try to calm my nerves. When I parked the truck and stepped out of the cab, the sensation of being watched hit me like a punch to the stomach. I looked around, but there was no one there, just the silence and darkness. As I walked to the convenience store, I felt invisible eyes following me. It was as if the night itself was alive and watching me. Inside the store, the atmosphere was oppressive. The clerk, a middle-aged man with deep dark circles under his eyes, barely looked at me as I grabbed a coffee cup. The radio behind the counter was static, emitting a continuous crackle that heightened the tension in the air. I paid for the coffee and left as quickly as I could, eager to get back to my truck and continue my journey. When I returned, I found something that chilled me to the bone. The cab doors, which I was sure I had closed, were slightly ajar. I climbed back in and noticed that some items inside were out of place. My cell phone, which I had left on the console, was now on the passenger seat. A map that had been folded in a glove compartment was now spread out on the dashboard. My heart raced. Had someone been inside while I was gone? I decided to lock the doors tightly and continue driving. But the strange events didn't stop there. As I moved down the road, the truck's radio began making intermittent static noises, as if it were picking up fragments of conversations from another world. Indistinct voices and whispers mixed with the music, creating a chorus of terror that seemed to intensify with every mile. At one point, I spotted something on the side of the road. A dark, tall, and slender figure stood on the shoulder, barely visible out of the corner of my eye. When I turned my head to look directly, it vanished, leaving only darkness and my imagination to fill the void. The figure continued to appear, always at a distance, always just beyond the direct line of my vision. My fear grew, and I didn't know how much longer I could endure. The cargo behind me seemed to have a life of its own, pulsing and vibrating like a malevolent heart. And I was trapped there, alone, with only my thoughts and that damned container for company. As the night progressed, a terrible certainty began to form in my mind. I was transporting something far beyond my understanding. Something that might be alive, something that didn't want to be taken to its final destination. And the feeling of being watched only intensified, turning my journey into an endless nightmare. Whatever was happening, I knew I had to keep going. But every mile drove me deeper into an abyss of terror and madness, where reality blurred with the unknown, and the line between what was real and what wasn't grew ever thinner. I drove through a haze of fear and exhaustion. The coffee no longer helped, and the radio continued with its static and unsettling murmurs. Every mile seemed to drag on, and time lost all meaning. I no longer knew if it was night or day, if the hours were passing or if I was stuck in an endless loop. The first hallucinations began with headlights reflecting in the rearview mirror. It was as if someone was following me closely, but every time I looked, the car disappeared. At one point, the mirror reflected something much worse, my wife's face, with a look of panic and wide eyes. I almost lost control of the truck when I saw that. I blinked, and the face vanished, leaving only darkness. When I finally stopped at an empty gas station to try to catch my breath, the attendant approached with a strange look. He didn't say anything, just watched me as I filled up. His presence was unsettling, as if he knew something I didn't. When I went to pay, he finally spoke, in a low, raspy voice, "You shouldn't be here. No one passes this road with a load like that without paying a price." His words echoed in my mind as I returned to the truck, the feeling of being watched growing with every step. On the way back, I saw something disturbing on the road, deep tracks, as if something heavy had been dragged along there. The tracks were irregular and seemed to follow the path I was taking. It felt like something was following me, or worse, guiding me. I knew I should stop and investigate, but something inside me told me to keep going, as if stopping was the worst thing I could do. As I continued, I started having waking nightmares. I saw familiar faces along the road, waving at me, their faces contorted in terror and agony. At one point, I saw my mother, who had passed away years ago, looking at me from the side of the truck. Her eyes were filled with tears, and she seemed to be trying to say something. I knew it wasn't real, but the vision left me paralyzed with fear. The cargo behind me seemed to be alive. I could hear whispers, like a distant conversation I couldn't understand. The vibration was now constant, and the container seemed to pulse, almost as if it were breathing. It was a suffocating feeling, as if the cargo itself was trying to communicate, or worse, escape. That's when I realized the terrible truth. What I was transporting wasn't just an ordinary load. It was something alive, or perhaps something that had once been alive. The tracks on the road, the whispers, the visions, everything indicated that I was dealing with something beyond my understanding. Something ancient and malevolent that seemed to feed off my fear and despair. The realization hit me like a blow. I was carrying something that shouldn't have been moved. something that was meant to stay where it was, locked and forgotten. And now, I was part of its plan, a pawn in a game I didn't understand. But what terrified me most was the idea that, regardless of whether I completed the delivery or not, I was already lost. The cargo had marked me, and no matter where I went, I would never be truly free of it. With this revelation, the terror I felt turned into pure panic. I needed to get rid of that cargo, but how? And if I abandoned it, what would happen to me? With every mile, the sense that something terrible was about to happen increased, and I knew that, somehow, I had to stop this madness before it was too late. My mind was on the brink of collapse. The hallucinations and whispers coming from the cargo became unbearable, a cacophony of voices that seemed to know all my fears and secrets. Each murmured word felt like a knife plunging into my sanity. With every mile, the road ahead distorted, turning into an endless tunnel of darkness and despair. I tried to seek help. I stopped at a police station in the middle of nowhere, a small building with flickering lights in the darkness. When I entered, I was met by two officers who looked at me with suspicion. I explained the situation, trying to sound rational, but their expressions only grew more skeptical. "You're fine, sir. There's no one following you, and the cargo is just a box," they said, trying to calm me. But I knew they were wrong. I could feel the weight of something watching from beyond the station walls. The radio on their desk began to crackle with static, and for a moment, I heard a desperate scream. The officers seemed to be unaware, and realizing they couldn't help me, I left as quickly as possible. Attempts to abandon the cargo also failed. I stopped the truck on a deserted road, ready to leave the container behind and walk away. But when I stepped out of the cab, my legs shook, and I felt an invisible force pulling me back. It was as if the cargo itself had a will of its own, preventing me from leaving. Back in the truck, I found that the engine wouldn't start, and the radio emitted distorted laughter, mocking my panic. It was useless. The cargo wouldn't let me go so easily. Then I began to understand the true nature of what I was carrying. The visions became clearer, revealing scenes of dark rituals and hooded figures, their faces obscured by shadow. The voices, now more distinct, spoke of an ancient power, an entity trapped inside the container, worshipped by a secret cult. They had imprisoned it centuries ago, and my job was to deliver it to a location where the final ritual could be completed. I was just the last in a line of many who served this purpose, an involuntary pawn in a scheme of darkness and sacrifice. The final revelation came when, in a moment of madness, I opened the container. Inside, there was nothing but a large wooden chest with arcane symbols carved into its surface. A palpable energy emanated from it, almost knocking me down. The chest was locked, but I knew that what was inside should not be released. Somehow, the cult was trying to bring something back to our reality, something that should never have been freed. As despair consumed me, a final vision showed me the true horror. I was destined to be the last sacrifice, the soul needed to complete the ritual. The voices were now clear, demanding my obedience, promising pain and torment if I did not comply. And then, I realized that no matter what I did, the fate was already sealed. Paranoia ate away at me from within. I could feel the entity inside the chest, its malevolent intentions permeating the air around me. The vision showed me how I would be consumed, used as fuel to bring this thing back to our world. And so, the only solution left to me was the most desperate, to end it all. The idea of driving the truck off a cliff came like a flash of clarity amid the madness. I knew where there was a cliff nearby, a place where the road ended abruptly. The decision was made. The only way to rid myself of the cargo was to destroy everything, including myself. Every moment felt like an eternity as I drove toward the cliff. The truck's engine roared, echoing in the quiet of the night, but inside the cab, a sinister silence had settled, broken only by the whispers that never stopped. The voices were louder now, almost screaming, trying to dissuade me, promising unimaginable torment if I continued. The chest and the containers seemed to pulse with malignant energy, and I could feel a growing presence, as if the entity inside was aware of my plan and was desperately fighting to prevent me from completing it. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw, once again, the dark figure that had been following me from the start. This time, it was closer, almost tangible. Its empty eyes stared at me, and a wave of pure terror washed over me. It was as if all the darkness and malevolence in the world were concentrated in that one point. As the cliff approached, the voices became unbearable. They spoke in ancient, unknown tongues, but I understood the essence of what they said: promises of eternal pain, visions of a dark future where the entity would reign. My vision began to blur, and for a moment, reality and nightmare merged. I saw scenes of destruction, cities in flames, people screaming in agony, and at the center of it all, a shadowy figure feeding on suffering. But I knew I couldn't stop. Each time the visions threatened to consume me, I gripped the wheel tighter, focusing on the final destination: the cliff. It was my only chance to end it all. Every meter traveled was a victory against the terror enveloping me, against the entity trying to corrupt my will. When I finally reached the cliff, the ground ahead simply disappeared, giving way to a black, infinite abyss. The final moments were a blur of adrenaline and despair. The voices reached a deafening crescendo, a cacophony of hatred and despair that seemed to vibrate in my bones. But I was determined. I looked at the chest one last time, feeling the penetrating gaze of the entity. And then, with a cry of pure rage and defiance, I pressed the accelerator. The truck flew through the air, and for a brief moment, there was silence. A moment of absolute stillness, where everything seemed to stop. I felt a strange peace, as if I was finally free of the nightmare. But then, the world started moving again, and the truck began to fall. The impact was inevitable. As the truck plummeted, I felt a final wave of despair. The visions returned, stronger than ever, showing the fate I was trying to avoid. The hooded figure, the entity, now clearly visible, smiled at me, as if it knew something I didn't. The chest, still locked, began to glow with a sinister light, and for a moment, I thought I could hear laughter. Not the laughter from the radio, but something deeper, older. The impact came like an explosion, and everything went black. For a moment, there was only emptiness. Then, one last thought crossed my mind: did I truly manage to destroy the entity? Or did it simply let me believe I had one? The story ends with this question unresolved. The truck driver, the truck, and the cargo vanished into the abyss, but the ultimate fate of the entity and the driver remains uncertain. Perhaps the entity was destroyed, perhaps it escaped, or perhaps, somehow, the driver is still trapped in his nightmare, paying the price for transporting something that should never have been moved. Whatever happened, the mystery and terror of the journey continue, haunting the memories and accounts of those who dared to hear this dark story.